macroevolution, in which we're going to be looking at things called adaptive radiations. But before I introduce those, I just wanted to zoom in a little on the impact that individual adaptations can have. And this image shown on the slide here is what I think is a super cool example of the impact that adaptations can have, and is taken from a thing called the long-term evolution experiment. Now, this is an experiment that has been running since the 24th of February 1988, and it started with 12 initially identical populations of the bacterium E. coli. Every day since that point, with a small gap for COVID, 1% of each of those populations has been transferred into a new Petri dish of growth medium, and that's just repeated every day. Every day that new transferred population will then multiply, and the E. coli will ultimately evolve. Every 500 or so generations, a sample of this E. coli is frozen. That can be revived at any point. And it essentially creates a fossil record of the experiment. As the experiment goes along, at any point you can take E. coli from a previous generation, make them compete with the current generation, and, for example, work out the relative fitness of those two generations. In this experiment, fitness, at least in the early generations, is dominated by the appearance of new mutations. And those mutations, the ones that are selected for, the ones that survive in the experiment, are those with large beneficial effects. They form things that are known as selective sweeps. When a mutation appears, those E. coli with the mutation are fitter and ultimately outcompete the other individuals in a population. In this graph, the colours show 42 mutations within the E. coli in one population over the first 20,000 generations of this experiment. And it's really, really interesting. So if we look, for example, we've got here a series of 4 mutations that have allowed this blue color, which represents the population bearing those 4 mutations, to very, very quickly outcompete other variants of E. coli and comprise the entire population in this experiment. And if we look here, another 4 mutations are associated with this group of organisms that starts off relatively as a relatively small proportion of the population, doesn't grow particularly rapidly until another set of mutations occur. And then when they do, suddenly those clades, these groups that are represented by red, go on to dominate the population of this experiment. You can see that at any point we have transient coexistence of different collections of mutations until the most successful ultimately outcompete the others. And that is a graphic representation of these selective sweeps. We can in fact compare that fairly readily to the selective sweeps that occurred in COVID. You may remember early in the COVID pandemic that we had different varieties of COVID that would sweep through the population, suddenly cause more problems. It started with Alpha and then Delta and then Omicron and a series of other groups of COVID or particular varieties of COVID to which the population had a lower immunity due to the mutations in that group would suddenly become the dominant strain. It's exactly the same process that occurs in COVID and occurs in this. And we think that occurs broadly in other parts of the natural world as groups evolve. So that, I think, is a really nice demonstration of the impact that a beneficial adaptation can have on the course of evolution. But of course, that is in single-celled, non-sexual prokaryotes. So these are obviously incredibly important organisms, but it's worth also thinking about what would happen in eukaryotes, which are very different organisms and often have sexual reproduction as well, which makes them just a tiny bit different to the prokaryotes that we're seeing evolve in this experiment. Well, there are probably quite a few things that I can say about adaptations in eukaryotes, but I thought I'd focus on a thing called an adaptive radiation. Adaptations have a broad range of impacts on eukaryotes, which undergo sexual reproduction and a whole host of other behaviors as well. Often we believe that adaptations have their origin in things called adaptive radiations, and I've put a definition on the slide for you here. An adaptive radiation is the evolution from a single ancestral form into many, resulting from the exploitation of an array of niches. These are events in which a single lineage rapidly diversifies, and the newly formed lineages that have evolved from that original one evolve different adaptations. That could be, for example, through new and efficient modes of feeding, or it may be through the ability to conquer a new habitat, for example, through the evolution of flight, allowing things to take to the air. Or we may be looking at an environmental change that makes different or more resources available. That could be more space, more evolutionary niches, or more types of food, for example, or alters the way that species interact. In all of those cases, we may expect the pattern that we see to be an adaptive radiation. And indeed, we think these are important features of large-scale evolution. It's hard to be sure, but such radiations may well underlie a decent proportion of the diversity of life on Earth today. Those were very simple words to make such a meal of saying them. I can only apologize. A really famous example that we have touched on elsewhere when talking about niche partitioning in ecology was Darwin's finches. These are a group of finches. One of them is shown on the slide here. Isn't it handsome? That are found on the Galapagos Islands. We know that a single finch from the Galapagos Islands at some point has evolved into all of the different forms that there are found on the Galapagos Islands today. Today, there are multiple species. Exactly how many depends on whose taxonomy you follow. There's probably around 18. And all of those have evolved from a common ancestor. Each of those species that has evolved has a specialized mode of feeding. The example here, shown on the top left, number 1, is the large ground finch. This has a super big, chunky beak. It lives on the ground and it feeds on large seeds and insects, but can also use that impressive beak to crack open nuts. We can compare that species with the species shown on the bottom right. It's evolved from the same ancestor. This is a green warbler finch, if you're interested, but it's much smaller. It has a relatively slight, well, I suppose we would say in biology, a gracile beak. So kind of not as chunky. And it uses that beak to capture insects and process small fruit for food. Each of these species, as a rule, is found on all of the islands in the Galapagos, and on each it appears to be part of the same ecological niche. So this is the classic example of an adaptive radiation. Now, we also see adaptive radiations in the fossil record fairly frequently. A very obvious and apt example is the fact that when colonizers repopulated ecosystems that have been vacated but have been emptied by a mass extinction, often you'll get a limited number of lineages as the initial colonizers, and all of those will be subject then to an adaptive radiation as they repopulate their vacated ecospace. Now, there's quite a lot of research into radiations and their impacts, and I'm going to show you some examples of those that include the fossil record shortly. But first, I just wanted to start by giving you another example of what I think is a really super, super cool example of an adaptive radiation. This example draws on the Caribbean anolis lizards. This is a genus of lizards that's widespread in North America. I say a genus. Actually, some of these aren't actually members of the genus Anolis, but it's a broader group. Now, on each of the islands of the Greater Antilles, and if you're wondering, don't worry, I had to look it up too, that's Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, members of this group show similar adaptations that reflect their different modes of life. Indeed, these species have been placed into 6 categories that we can call ecomorphs based on where they live. This can range from living on the ground and the trunk of trees through all of the way to living in the crown of trees on the twigs and the trunk. And you can see some examples, some images here showing examples of the ecomorphs on this slide here. As an example, Anolis capito, this handsome lizard in the middle, oh, what a cool dude, spends much of its time on the ground. It rarely ventures into trees, and that's reflected by this graph on the right-hand side here. By contrast, I've not said this word before. Biporcatus? Biporcatus? Sounds about right. This little dude on the left, bottom left, is rarely seen on the ground, preferring to spend most of its time in the trees, as shown on the far right in this graph here. So that's really interesting. We've got these different morphs of lizard that seem to inhabit slightly different bits of the trees of these islands. Although, as you can see from the graph here, it's not 100% clear cut. There's actually quite a lot of nuance. And this is a highly studied system. So these categories are actually a little more complex than I've let on. And if you want to learn more about it, do check out this paper here. I think it's a really good introduction to this cool system from 2021. So please do check that out if you're interested. But what's really interesting about this is that on closer inspection, those ecomorphs seem to comprise a different species on each island of the Greater Antilles. So it appears like on each island, the anolis lizards have evolved a consistent set of morphological adaptations independently of the other islands. And all of those are convergent examples of an adaptive radiation within the anolis lizards. So that's super duper interesting. It's been used to study whether evolution is deterministic. For our purposes, we can say that means it's kind of repeatable. If you were to do it all over again, would you expect the same outcome or a different one? And also, it's been used to study whether the structure of ecological communities can exhibit stability over macroevolutionary, so big timescales. And in this case, it does appear that evolution is both repeatable and predictable when it comes at least to these anolis lizards. So it's really interesting. I want to dig a little deeper into these examples by providing you with a couple of insights from studies that have looked at this in a bit more depth, and one of which involves the fossil record. So the first paper that I cite here, Shirat et al. From 2015, looks at this radiation and adds fossils to the mix. It's based on Hispaniolan, anolis lizard ecomorph, so that's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And before this paper was published, these lizards had a very poor fossil record. There were only 3 known species. This paper added 20 new fossils to that count and used CT scanning to describe these new species. You can see some beautiful examples of this on the slide here. So here is a fossil lizard in amber, and here's a CT scan of the lizard I think one of these is this one, showing the bones inside that hole that has been left within the amber. But because of CT scanning, you can also recover the external morphology of these fossils. So you can see some examples of CT scans here where you can see the skin of these beautiful lizard fossils. The authors of that paper use these fossils to demonstrate that the anolis ecomorphs evolved early in the Caribbean adaptive radiation of these groups, and that community structure has pretty much been stable ever since that early adaptive radiations, suggesting that these are long-term and relatively stable structure, which is really, really interesting. I also put a link to a reference to a more recent paper here from 2021, which shows that this pattern also holds for mainland species. Both of these examples together suggest that the structure of ecological communities can exhibit stability over long timescales. So this is a really interesting, I think, example of evolution in general and of adaptive radiation. So please do check out the literature if you are interested in learning more about these super cool lizards. They're really, really neat. I wanted to finish this video by talking about adaptive radiation and rates, because in macroevolution, everything overlaps with everything else. Whilst this makes being certain about things tricky at times, it also opens up loads of interesting avenues of research. So let's demonstrate that by thinking about how the rates of evolution may intersect with adaptive radiations. If you so wish, you can pause the video right now. You can do. And think about whether you would expect rates of evolution during an adaptive radiation to be gradual, or could they be concentrated towards the beginning or possibly the end of an adaptive radiation? It's worth thinking about. So feel free to pause, and otherwise we can move on and actually have a look at what the fossil record can tell about us about this. So let me tell you now that the commonly but not universally held view is that an adaptive radiation is likely to be marked by diversification and morphological evolution slowing down after an initial phase of rapid adaptation to the ecological niches in that adaptive radiation. So this pattern we can call an early burst of evolution in the course of an adaptive radiation. Now, early bursts of diversification are thought to occur because ecological, i.e. niche space, becomes increasingly filled over time. We can, of course, think about this in terms of adaptive radiation, both in terms of taxonomic diversity, how many species there are, and the process of speciation. But we can also think about it in terms of a thing called morphological disparity, the number of different morphologies we would expect or we see in adaptive radiation. In an early burst radiation, we would expect rates of evolution and thus disparity to be high early on, and in some, but not all definitions of an early burst, this would be accompanied by high rates of speciation. This is a pattern that is actually relatively commonly reported from the fossil record, and I wanted to give you two examples of adaptive radiations from the fossil record for the remainder of this video. But be aware that this pattern is not so well supported necessarily, or not as well established in living groups. You can read more about that in this paper from Mark Puttick from 2018 that I've put on the slide. So the first example of a fossil-rich adaptive radiation that I wanted to give you is in the marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs specifically. This paper from Moon and Stubbs in 2020 is the first study to look at rates along across the whole group of the ichthyosaurs for the 160 million years of their existence. So this is really big scale stuff. And in this paper, the authors use cladistic data. So these are discrete characters. If you don't recall what those are or want to learn more about them, do check out the phylogeny material associated with this course. So these authors use cladistic data and skull length, that's a continuous character of how long the skull is, to run analyses that look at changes in disparity, a thing called morphospace, how different these things are to each other and how that's organized into a multidimensional space, and evolutionary rates within this group. And they make the case that the ichthyosaurs show an archetypal early burst trend that's driven by ecological opportunity in the seas of the Triassic period. They identify high rates of evolution early in the history of the group, with a rapid diversification in the taxonomy, the number of species, the morphology, that's the disparity, the number of different morphologies there are in the group, and in the ecology of this group. To dig into their results a tiny bit more with the graphs that I've put on this slide here from that paper, on the top left, you can see rates of discrete character evolution. These are the rates of evolution of the zeros and ones from which they build their phylogeny. And you can see that on the left here in the Triassic, these rates are far higher than they are for the remainder of the existence of this group of marine reptiles. That is largely mirrored in continuous characters. That's the measurement of the length of the skulls of these animals, as shown in the graph on the bottom left. And they've also taken the tree that they've created for this study and mapped evolutionary rates in terms of the color here from purple through to yellow onto the tree. And as you can see, that most of the high rates in this tree are concentrated towards the origin of the ichthyosaurs, towards the kind of the left-hand side of this tree. So all of this is showing us a picture of an early burst followed by relatively slower rates in the evolution of the ichthyosaurs. And in this case, the authors argue that this deceleration of evolution is particularly strong after a bottleneck that ichthyosaurs went through in the latest Triassic period. The Jurassic and the Cretaceous ichthyosaurs were significantly less disparate and evolved less quickly than this group had done earlier in the Triassic species. Indeed, recent discoveries of large but early fossils you can see an example in this paper from 2021 that I put on the slide here, support this picture in ichthyosaurs of higher range of morphological morphologies in the group, so higher morphological disparity early on than there was later. So in the fossil record and in this group, there is evidence for early bursts. It has also long been held that mammals underwent irradiation after the KPG extinction. That's the extinction that led to the ultimate demise of the non-avian dinosaurs. And that's potentially because the mammals filled the niches that were vacated by the dinosaur extinction. The tree on the right-hand side shows the diversification timings within the crown group of mammals, i.e. those that are still alive today. And this paper highlights that in the earliest branching events in the extant mammal tree, so in the last example, we were looking at the root of the lineage that went to today's mammals, and now we're looking at the earliest splits in that lineage. So this paper suggests that the earliest branching events in the extant mammal tree seem to coincide with the breakup of continental land masses and rising sea levels that occurred in the late Cretaceous. So these are the splits that you can see here. That was followed by what appears to be a second pulse of diversification immediately after the KPG extinction. And the authors of this paper, I've put a reference on the slide for you here, relate that second burst of evolution within the groups to numerous factors. They say that number one, mammals fill the ecological niches vacated by the dinosaurs because of the KPG extinction, driving the dinosaurs to extinction. So that's a classic story that I've already mentioned. They highlight also, which is interesting, that burst of evolution was coupled with changes in sea level and, as a result, the emergence of land, allowing greater geographic continuity in the globe after the KPG extinction. They also highlight that there were a large number of climatic shifts around this time. And they make the case that all of those factors, those three factors, combine to give enhanced opportunities for mammalian diversification after the KPG extinction. So that's really, really interesting. That's the evolution of mammals seems to be a story of potentially successive radiations, which I think is super, super cool. And that's it for rates. Let's finish up by looking at a slightly different area of research that's still highly relevant for understanding macroevolution in video number 5. I'll see you there very, very shortly.